everyone. My name is Heidi Miskala, and I'm a Senior Principal Scientist in Outcomes Research at Merck & Company. And I will serve as a moderator for our session today. Welcome, everyone, and thank you again for joining for our session. So our session today is going to be focusing on stakeholder perspectives on core outcome sets. We will have speakers representing the patient, payer, and regulatory perspectives who will provide their views and experiences as it relates to core outcome sets. We will have 4 presentations during our session today by Sally Oakland, who's an independent consultant, Eleanor Perfetto from the National Health Council, Robin Bent from US FDA, and Tom Wallach from Discern Health, or W2O. And without further delay, I would like to start with the first presentation. It is my pleasure to introduce Sally Oakland, who is an independent consultant focused on person-generated data and patient-public involvement in care, research, and policy. Previously, she has served as the Director of the Policy and Ethics at the United Health Group Research and Development, and she has spent 12 years at Patients Like Me, where she developed the site's patient voice ontology, drug safety platform, FDA research collaboration, and the Ethics and Compliance Advisory Board. She's a registered nurse by training, and she completed her graduate work at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management. Sally will be presenting today on exploring patient-informed principles.
It's a real pleasure to be part of this important discussion today. And I'd like to thank the organizers and ISOQOL for giving me the opportunity to explore a number of patient-informed principles related to measurement and how those principles can be applied as the development of core outcome sets becomes more and more common across clinical care as well as in other environments. So walk with me through some of our presentation this morning, and we're going to talk a bit about the ways that patients can inform us on the principles that they think are important for measurements that matter. Too often, we can lose sight of the experiences of patients in the course of doing our work in healthcare. And I think as this slide so aptly demonstrates, the opportunity to explore with the patient the results of tests that have come back great, oftentimes loses the opportunity to really discuss with the patient the things that are on their mind, the critical experiences that are interfering with their quality of life. So it's important for us to keep in mind that behind every bit of data, whether it's quantitative or qualitative data, is a patient's story. And really, it's the patients themselves who can inform us most about what matters most to them. Even if you were to take a quick look at this cartoon, which actually was created some time ago, and think about the ways that other sources of data could be used to get at the things that the patient is actually thinking. And he's got a watch on his wrist. How can we use digital health tools to get at mobility and understand the sleep patterns for this particular patient so that we aren't losing the opportunity to incorporate information that could be measured regularly over time and not leave it solely to the patient to feel comfortable bringing that information to our attention. But I think it's important when we talk about measurement and we talk about core measure sets that we think about what's the awareness of most patients about the measure requirements that exist in healthcare or for which their providers are held accountable. You know, most patients, however, will have opinions about what's important to them and can provide very valuable insights as we begin to think about how to fill measurement gaps that are long overdue to be filled. So when given the opportunity, patients can offer very specific guidance and practical principles that can reflect their experiences, their expertise with their own condition, and the expectations that they have for care, and even participating in research and policy development. So I think it's a critical opportunity for us to take a step back and think about the ways that we can, in fact, gather that information effectively. I was with Patients Like Me, an online environment for patients with conditions to connect with each other, to share insights and to share their life-changing experiences as a result of the conditions that they're living with for over 12 years. During that time, we spent a lot of time as a team working directly with our patients to better understand their experiences and finding ways with their insight to help us prepare a way of gathering that data in such a way that actually was not only useful for them, but that we could also use to better explore research questions on their behalf. So we developed mechanisms for ethnographic interviewing where we would gather information from patients themselves to provide us useful guidance for developing, implementing, and evaluating not only the measure sets that we were creating, but I'm postulating here that we can also use these insights for the ongoing development of core measure sets going forward. So I'm going to cover three areas where we actually did collect patient-informed principles, and we can then begin to think about ways that they can be incorporated into the work of measure development. So first of all, what do patients want from measurement, from the design of those measures, and how they partner with us as we go forward in collecting this kind of data? What do they need from the data that we collect? Patient-generated data is not new, but patient experience reports are relatively new, and finding ways of incorporating those experience reports into regulatory opportunities or care improvement or quality improvement in the care experience is really critical for us to better understand what is it about the patient-generated data that's really most critical for patients to want to share. And then ultimately, at the end of the day these days, our commitment to digitize data and how we respect it and honor it and steward that data is critically important. And I think that we're seeing that in everyday life as we approach the opportunities to learn and develop evidence from the COVID-19 experience as well. So we'll be reviewing the principles that patients have helped us develop in all three of these areas as we go forward here. So let's begin with measurement principles. What do patients want measures to be for them? I think the critical piece here is these are very practical. These are very pragmatic. They want to understand what it is that we're asking them about if it's going to be a measure where they're reporting something about their experience. They also want to know that they can answer that question. They want us to be sure that we are efficiently using their time and that ultimately what we're gathering on that data is really relevant to them and describes their actual experiences. One of the most critical things that I actually learned a lot about from our patients at Patients Like Me was just how critically important it is for them to learn something. So making the measure something that helps them better understand their condition or their treatments or potential side effects they may be experiencing, making that educational was really critically important, as well as making that actionable and being sure that we focus on the positivity side of measures versus on the negative side of measures, which is something that actually our patients told us was quite important. When you think about design principles, what patients want from measures, they want to be sure that we're actually giving them the opportunity to be seen as a whole person. They want to have the experience of going on a journey with us, not necessarily on their own, in terms of thinking about the ways that data kind of comes together and actually helps them capture their truth. Again, I think these are pragmatic and practical principles that ultimately every measure developer should be thinking about in terms of helping the patient feel in control, feel confident, being able to build on what they already know or what they already do, and then helping them prioritize and thinking about ways of making their experiences more valuable to the clinical encounter. Patients actually were pretty pragmatic, again, about what they want in partnerships with their clinicians or with researchers. And interestingly enough, when the team of advisors at Patients Like Me developed these principles in their report of 2016, they actually focused on their responsibilities. And I think sometimes we lose sight of the fact that patients themselves want to assume some responsibility when they can to be a full partner in their care, but they're oftentimes not given that opportunity. So patients actually were pretty clear. They were telling each other, you need to know your own needs. You need to be sure that you're ready to align in a partnership with your provider, to really be sure that you're not just on the way out the door and saying, oh, by the way, I didn't tell you about this particular incident that occurred. Be sure that you're finding ways of sharing that responsibility for understanding the experiences as they evolve over time. Respect and listen and communicate. These are things that, are just basic tenets of being a good partner, whether it's in a relationship with your provider or a relationship with our friends, and evolving and accepting the growth that happens as that relationship and that partnership evolves and changes over time. And lastly, being able to step back, reflect, and evaluate and reprioritize the things that matter to you are critically important for patients and sometimes do get overlooked. When the clinical encounter is only every few months or even every year for an annual exam, it's sometimes you lose sight of the things that may have to be reprioritized as a result of the things that occurred over the course of the last few months. What do patients need from measures? One of the interesting things that we worked on at Patients Like Me was a project with the National Quality Forum on trying to understand, in fact, very much about what this whole topic is about, measuring what matters to patients. One of the things that we learned as we developed these patient experience reports with patients, that we were able to improve the quality of patient reported and generated data by engaging patients themselves in that development, in that opportunity to collect data that they wanted to share, but giving them an opportunity to have the quality of that data, the recall of that data much more meaningful. The opportunity to represent their real world experiences, things that they live with day to day that happen outside of the clinical gaze, is incredibly important. And then identifying their concerns that are not currently measured. One of the areas that we worked on in this project was showing patients with rheumatoid arthritis, with multiple sclerosis, with COPD, the measures that are currently used for their conditions, and said, what's missing? Are there things here that you would like to see measured? And frankly, they had some great suggestions. So the opportunity to be able to get that input, prioritize and focus on the symptom assessments of what's important in their daily life is absolutely very, very critical for success in a core measure set. And then finally, I want to introduce you to what patients expect from the data sharing experiences that they're having now. Over the last number of years, the opportunity to continuously collect data from patients, whether it's through digital health tools, sensors and devices and that sort of thing, or through ongoing patient-reported outcome measures that we collect over time, patients recognize that this data is being digitized, that we are putting all of this data in some format together to try to better understand not only the individual experience, but also how those individual experiences can actually influence population experiences and population health and outcomes. So with the help of our Ethics and Compliance Advisory Board at Patients Like Me, as well as with our team of advisors and our many thousands of patient ambassadors that were part of the site, we actually worked for almost 18 months on the development of commitments during the digital age to being good stewards of data and being able to return that data in a meaningful, quantifiable way to patients. So the 6 principles are actually, again, very practical. One of the most important things that patients kept bringing to the top of this list was continuous and shared learning. They are very committed to understanding things over time and find it very difficult to do that if we're not continuously giving them an opportunity to let them know what we're learning as we start collecting data. And the core measure sets are a perfect opportunity for doing that, giving people an opportunity to see things, how they evolve over time, based on input that they may have given, so that it could ultimately be shared and provided for individual use as well as for a broader audience. These are really grounded in a socially responsible ethics. And so, the idea of respecting choice and preferences is important and certainly a critical part of any ethical relationship that we have with patients and the public. And the other piece of this was, helping them understand that not only are we asking for their consent sometimes to gather this data, but they want to understand what that consent means. So it's not simply a form that they sign and then feel they give over to the research or the clinical care environment, but that they actually understand what our intent is to be able to take that data and use that meaningfully, not only for them, but for others like them as well. It was important for our patients to communicate about patient-informed governance. The idea that entities own their data or have access to their data without their input in the governance of that data was really something that patients wanted to elevate to an important area of change and a paradigm shift. And I think we're beginning to see some of that happening, particularly in light of COVID-19 and how patient experiences are oftentimes happening outside of the clinical gaze. And we need to be able to find ways of being able to bring that data into meaningful use for evidence development over time with this very insidious novel coronavirus. Again, open communication and transparency, these are obvious. Accountable conduct related to outcomes. They want to be sure that we're evaluating how we're doing. They want to be sure that we're moving forward with outcomes that actually do matter to patients. And then lastly, although most importantly, and I think it's in light of the experiences that we are all having today, inclusivity, diversity, and equity. We simply can no longer just preach about these things. We have to practice them, and we have to include real people in that opportunity to do that. And each one of these is its own subject, all on its own, that needs our attention and ongoing caring about for patients to be directly involved in how we do this. And I'll leave you with this. I think for a core outcome set to have real value to patients themselves, we need to recognize that we aren't necessarily seeking new opportunities to see the experiences that they have already and that they're living already, but really refocusing our eyes on the things that they prioritize and the things that they want to bring to our attention in novel ways, but also in ways that we can find meaningful and that they can find meaningful, so that we actually have the learning systems that we have been proposing for very, very long time now. I'll leave it at that, and I'm very happy to be a part of any further discussion as we go forward. Thank you very much.
The next presentation is by Dr. Eleanor Perfetto. Eleanor is an Executive Vice President at the National Health Council. She's also a Professor of Pharmaceutical Health Service Research at the University of Maryland. Her research and policy work has primarily focused on patient engagement in comparative effectiveness and patient-centered outcomes research, medical product development, patient-reported outcome selection and development, and healthcare quality. Dr. Perfetto holds a PhD, BS and MS degrees in pharmacy from the University of Rhode Island and a PhD from the University of North Carolina School of Public Health. Eleanor's presentation today will provide the patient advocacy community perspective on core outcome tests.
Thank you, and I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to be here today. It's a pleasure to follow after Sally. She's been talking about the work that she's done in the past on working with individual patients, and I'm going to jump into talking about the patient advocacy community, the patient groups. I think one of the things that I want to begin by telling you is that the National Health Council is a membership organization, and among our members, we have over 60 patient advocacy organizations, and these are the logos for those organizations. So you can see that it's anything from the largest groups in the United States, like the American Heart Association and the American Diabetes Association, but it also includes many of the smaller groups that represent the rare disease community. And so when we talk about the patient advocacy community, we're talking about this membership that we have, and we're talking largely today about what we hear from them and what we learn from them, especially when it comes to the outcomes that patients are looking for. I want to add to the conversation that Sally started by talking about the definitions that we use at the National Health Council and among the patient community when we talk about measuring the outcomes that are important to patients. And so I'm going to begin with talking about what we consider to be patient-centered. Our definition and the way we use that phrase is any process, program, or decision focused on patients in which patients are playing an active role as meaningfully engaged participants. And the central focus of that engagement is on optimizing the use of the information that the patients provide. So patient-centered means doing things with patients, not for patients or to patients. When we think about something being patient-centered, we've already said that patients have to be meaningfully engaged. And what do we mean by that? We refer to the active, meaningful, authentic, and collaborative interaction between patients, and in this case, researchers, but it could be other stakeholders across all stages of the research process, where the research decision-making is guided by patients' contributions as partners, recognizing their unique experiences, values, and expertise. I think it's really important for this audience when it comes to definitions to understand how we also think about what's patient-centered versus what's patient-reported when we're talking about outcomes. And so you see here, patient-centered is referring to the outcomes that patients report as important to them. And it can be any kind of outcome. When we talk about patient-reported outcomes, we recognize that the definition is outcomes that can only be reported by the patient on how they feel and how they function. And so what we're really looking for and what's really meaningful to patients are those where that Venn diagram shows that they cross. They're the things that patients say are important to them, and in many cases, those will be things that are patient-reported, the way that they feel, the way that they function, pain, ability to sleep, fatigue, those kinds of things. But sometimes things that patients report as important to them are outside of that patient-reported circle. Sometimes they are biomarkers or things like survival, mortality. And so when we talk about patient-centered versus patient-reported outcomes, we really want to remember that not only are patient-reported outcomes patient-centered, there are other outcomes that can also be patient-centered, just simply because they are important to patients. To capture a lot of this information and to put it in a condensed place, we put together what we call our rubric to capture the patient voice. And this was put together by a multi-stakeholder group. It's a tool to provide the patient community and any other stakeholder to allow them to evaluate the attributes of patient-centeredness and guide them on what is meaningful patient engagement. And so it's a good reference that we like to see people use when they're talking about patient centricity and patient engagement. I'm going to give you an example. When we talk about the domains of patient centricity, they very much overlap with what Sally was talking about. It's a patient partnership. It's a partnership among a patient and other stakeholders. It drives at outcomes that patients care about. There's transparency so that patients can understand it and have clarity on what the topic is and what the objectives are. There's representativeness, meaning that the patients that are the target population for whatever that activity might be, that they are represented at the table. There's diversity, and as Sally said, we've always had this as one of our domains of patient centricity, but it's even more important today when we look at the inequity in healthcare and some of the disparities that we see. We talk about patient-centered data sources. We don't always have to go directly to patients in order to find out what is important to them, because they may have reported it elsewhere, and there may be other places where that information can come from so that you can reduce burden on patients. And then timeliness. Of course, we want to know things that are important to them during today, but also over the trajectory of their disease. So these are the domains that are in our rubric. In the beginning section of the rubric talks about meaningful patient engagement, and I want to give you an example here. Meaningful patient engagement refers to the direct relationships and partnerships that are bidirectional, reciprocal, and continuous in patient engagement, where communications are open and honest and clear, and the engagement goals, the participants, the methods, the desired impacts, etc., all of those things are clearly outlined and transparent to the patients that are the active partners. So here's an example of what we have in the rubric, and I chose this one specifically because I think it's relevant to the ISAQOL audience. So one of the characteristics of patient engagement is that outcomes important to patients are identified and incorporated, and that includes things such as functional status, symptoms, health-related quality of life, well-being, but there will also be clinical measures, survival, productivity, goals, expectations, aspirations, and some of the financial stress from healthcare costs. So examples in terms of the rubric, what is a meaningful way of capturing that versus what's insufficient or low? Well, meaningful would be that researchers partnered with a patient organization. This is an example. They partnered with a patient organization to identify a disease-specific outcome measure. After speaking directly with patients, it was determined that the new measure should be a patient-reported outcome, and patients were involved through the development and validation process of that patient-reported outcome tool. So the partnership is an example of meaningful engagement. Insufficient and low would be that a previously developed measure was included in a trial as an exploratory endpoint to improve the patient centricity of the research study. However, the measure was not developed with patient input and did not reflect the outcomes that are currently known to be most important to that patient population. So a low example of patient engagement and a low example of incorporating the outcomes that are important to patients. So this is one example. There are others that are included in that rubric. I want to jump now to the discussion about core outcome sets, which is, of course, the main topic for today. We refer to them as patient-centered core outcome sets because we really want core outcome sets that get at what patients care most about. So we define that as an agreed-upon standardized set of outcomes, often including the related measures and/or endpoints that would go with those outcome concepts that have been identified. And these should be the ones that are gathered and reported at minimum in research in specific areas of health or healthcare. The outcome concept identification and prioritization are guided by patient contributions as partners, recognizing their unique experiences, values, and expertise. So the emphasis here from our perspective is on it being a patient-centered core outcome set. So I want to walk through quickly a diagram just to emphasize what we're talking about when we say a patient-centered core outcome set. You see in the upper left-hand corner, we talk about patient engagement activities, and that would take place to uncover what matters most to those patients. In addition, of course, we'll talk to other stakeholders and we'll find out what's important to those stakeholders. And we would also do an environmental scan to find out what outcome concepts, measures, and endpoints already exist that might be able to feed into this process. From that, you get a pool of outcome candidate concepts, and then you go through a consensus process. And there are numerous organizations out there that have their various methodologies for coming to consensus. But you want the process to be structured, transparent, and multi-stakeholder with, of course, patients participating. From out of that process comes a core outcome set of concepts, those concepts that are most important to patients, giving emphasis on the patient centricity aspect of this. From there, you then go on to develop the measures. So you either select or develop measures that go with that core set of concepts. And you look for whether or not existing measures align with the core concepts that came out of the consensus process. And you also look for measures that, of course, are fit for purpose. So clinical outcome assessment that has psychometric testing or biomarker qualification, et cetera. And then you arrive at a core set of measures that align with the core outcome set concepts. From there, you determine those study endpoints, but focus on the green box, which talks about the possible uses. It could be that you're looking for a tool to measure a pro in clinical trials. You're looking for endpoints that might be studied in real-world evidence studies. You're looking at endpoints that might be the target for the development of quality measures. You're looking for value for the outcomes that would be assessed in a value assessment, or that might become the focus of a value-based agreement. So if we thought about what the potential would be if we were doing this right and really came up with the right core outcome set of concepts and focused on the measures aligned with that, then there could be multiple uses. And this is not to say that we would have one set of measures that would be used for every purpose. There would, of course, have to be adaptations for different scenarios and circumstances. But at least we would all be following the same roadmap. And I think that's what the idea behind patient-centered core outcome set should be, that we're all following the same roadmap and that we're looking for concepts, measures, and endpoints that can align as much as possible. And so you see that the patients would be one of the driving forces in all of this, and thus making it a patient-centered core outcome set. To get us there, as I said earlier, I think the goal is patient centricity at the core, with patient leadership, partnership, engagement, and capacity building. Core outcome sets, again, can serve as a function for a wide range of healthcare activities, as I mentioned in the previous slide. But what do we need in order to get there? We need to all get on the same page. And that's really important because I think there's a lot of different terminology that's being used, and we want to be able to standardize the terms, be sure that we're all in alignment on methodology and the methods, and thinking about what kinds of methods need to be developed and evolve, and what kind of standardize the approaches, all get on the same page about the approaches that we're taking. We don't want to be overly prescriptive because we want to have innovation in this field, and we know that we need that right now, but we do actually need the same roadmap so that we are all talking the same language. Of course, we need collaboration, multi-stakeholder collaboration, multidisciplinary collaboration. This is actually a very important point because when it comes to patient engagement, we really need to have the right skill set to be able to be conducting that type of patient engagement. And we also don't want to put inappropriate pressure on researchers who specialize in particular fields who don't specialize in qualitative research, who don't know how to go out and gather that information from patients. Well, they shouldn't be required to do that. They should know that they can turn to their colleagues and that other disciplines, the people that they can work with in order to get this information that they need in their work too. We need flexibility because we need to allow and support innovation and advancement in measurement and methods, which of course is a very important step for us for the future. And then we also need infrastructure. We need platforms to develop this work and to think about the structure and what the framework looks like for this kind of work. We need to be able to map between different kinds of measures that are aligned with one another. We need quality assurance that all this work is being done very well. Measures need to be maintained in the long run. This requires funding, and it requires a lot of coordination among patient groups, patient advocacy organizations, and of course government organizations like NIH, FDA, a quasi-governmental organization like PCORI, also bringing in the needs for CMS and some of the capabilities of CMS. And so when we think about where we want to go in the future with patient-centered core outcome sets, it's going to really rely upon collaboration among all of these stakeholders and the development of good infrastructure to be able to do this rigorously. I want to thank you, and I want to thank the organizers, and I look forward to Q&A.
The third presentation is by Captain Robin Dent from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Robin joined US FDA in 2019 as the Director of CDER's Patient-Focused Drug Development Initiative. Prior to joining FDA, Robin was the Chief Scientific Program Specialist at the National Institutes of Health. She has extensive experience in clinical trial design, conduct, and oversight. She earned her bachelor's degree in nursing from the Catholic University of America and master's degree from the George Washington University. And Robin will be providing the U.S. regulatory perspective on core outcome sets.
Great, thanks so much. I'm really happy to be here today to share with you a regulatory perspective on core outcome sets and how we see them fitting into drug development process. So this is my disclaimer slide. I have no conflicts of interest to report, but I do want to mention that the views expressed in the following presentation are mine and do not necessarily represent an official FDA position. So as we move forward, particularly as we discuss the utility of clinical outcome sets, it's important to understand FDA's role. It is one of the missions of the FDA to protect and promote the public health by evaluating the safety and effectiveness of new drugs. While we play a critical role in drug development, we're only part of the process. FDA does not develop drugs, nor do we conduct clinical trials. It's not our role to lead much of the development work on specific tools or for specific drug development programs. However, we do play a role in guiding, helping, and evaluating. But again, what's really important to note is that we're really just one piece of the puzzle. When drug developers come to us to discuss clinical trial endpoints for trials that they plan to submit as part of an application for marketing approval, we think about the information that we need to establish the safety and the efficacy of a medical product. This may not meet the needs of other stakeholders, whether those people are payers or clinicians, and I think that this is kind of where the challenges start to come in. So over the years, happily, we've seen increasing importance placed on incorporating patients into the drug development process. In fact, it has a name, patient-focused drug development. Patient-focused drug development is a systematic approach to help ensure that patients' experiences, perspectives, needs, and priorities are captured and meaningfully incorporated into drug development and program evaluation. As experts in what it's like to live with their condition, patients are uniquely positioned to inform the understanding of the therapeutic context for drug development and evaluation. The primary goal of patient-focused drug development is to better incorporate the patient's voice in drug development and evaluation, including but not limited to facilitating and advancing the use of systematic approaches to collect and use patient and caregiver input to inform drug development and regulatory decision-making, encouraging identification and use of approaches and best practices to facilitate patient enrollment in and minimizing the burden of patient participation in clinical trials, enhancing understanding and appropriate use of methods to capture information on patient preferences and the potential acceptability of trade-offs between treatment benefit and risk outcomes, and identifying the information that is most important to patients related to treatment benefits, risks, and burden, and how to best communicate the information to support their decision-making. This brings us to our vision for incorporating patient input as a standard of practice. We want to ensure confidence in the reliability and accuracy of patient experience data for regulatory decision-making. We want to reduce regulatory uncertainty for the sponsor by consistently applying standards. And we want to promote rapid and consistent adoption of new guidance, processes, and resources through good communication, both internal and external to FDA. And finally, as I kind of led with, we want to see sustained incorporation of the patient's experience in drug development and decision-making, making it a standard practice. But I think we can really see clinical outcome sets being impactful in all of these areas. At the same time, we need to be thoughtful about our approach to these sets. So to start off, one point that I'd like to stress here is that not all core outcome sets are created equal. Not all are created in a methodologically sound manner, and not all include input from patients. We believe that input from patients is an important component to ensuring that what is being measured as part of a set is something that's a meaningful endpoint for a patient. But for the sake of this conversation, please assume that I'm speaking about core outcome sets that are developed in a manner that is methodologically sound and incorporates the patient voice. A core set of endpoints for a given population or disease area can really be useful to regulators because it can increase the efficiency of the drug review process. Regulators only have to review the methodology of the core set once to ensure that it's fit for purpose, and our reviewers become familiar with the measures included in that set. This would be a big improvement over seeing multiple different but similar measures used across a single disease area. Core sets have advantages to drug developers because they can reduce regulatory uncertainty. If FDA has said, this is a core set of measures we recommend you use as part of your drug development process, this provides transparency and assures standards are consistently applied. Set may also allow for decreased staff training time at clinical sites if these core sets are part of the standard clinical assessment for a given population. The use of the core sets as part of a standard clinical assessment can provide real-world evidence to get long-term safety and effectiveness information because we have the same people using the same tools. And of course, most importantly, there are benefits to patients because these core sets should be developed in a partnership with patients, and also because a thoughtful upfront approach can, as a core set is being developed, can really lead to decreased burden. But of course, there are challenges too. And one of these challenges is in meeting the needs of all stakeholders within the core set, without the core set becoming unmanageable as it grows to meet everyone's needs. We've heard from patient groups that patients are being asked to complete multiple similar outcome measures because they're being used for different purposes. Quality of life information that's acceptable and necessary to health technology assessors may not be precise enough for regulatory decision-making, and the information required by FDA may not be the information that health technology assessors are able to use to make decisions on valuation. However, the thoughtful approach I mentioned earlier, where stakeholder needs are identified ahead of time and considered as the outcome sets are developed, can help mitigate this problem. Another challenge is identifying who's going to develop these core sets, and what if these core sets contain proprietary measures that make them cost-prohibitive. It's encouraging to see and hear so many thoughtful people from so many sectors who are all taking part in this challenge and thinking through how we can make core sets a sustainable part of healthcare. One way that FDA is working to move the process forward is through our standard core clinical outcome assessments and endpoint grant program. I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. The purpose of the standard core grant program is threefold. We aim to help make incorporating patient perspective more sustainable. We want to enable the development of publicly available standard core sets of measures of disease burden and treatment burden for a given area. We want to provide avenues to advance the use of patient input as an important part of drug development. And while we're all aware that the core sets can include items other than clinical outcome assessments and that not all clinical outcome assessments measure things that are important to patients, the Center for Drugs at FDA chose to focus on core sets for clinical outcome assessments because this is where we're having the greatest struggles from a methodologic standpoint, and also because clinical outcome assessment development is such an intense process. So basically, as a background, as patient-focused drug development efforts began maturing, FDA has noticed that there's currently limited coordination in the efforts to develop clinical outcome assessments, including within a given disease area. And there is the potential for a lot of duplication of effort and a diversity of measures. Proprietary tools have been developed at great cost, but then they have limited affordability and maybe sustainability. And FDA reviewers may currently receive multiple independent clinical outcome assessments for review, each of which takes time to understand and evaluate. And so we also see a variable quality of the tools and the resulting data that may limit the tool's utility for regulatory decision-making. The FDA grant program will enable development of standard core sets of measures of disease burden and treatment burden for a given area, and that will be made publicly available. So as part of the program, a standard core set can include different types of clinical outcome assessments and their related endpoints that assess a minimum list of impacts that matter most to patients, are likely to demonstrate change, including differences in trial arms related to disease burden, treatment burden, and if applicable, physical function, and really should be reported in a clinical trial. And we really expect that the grantees will conduct well-managed, transparent, and methodologically sound processes that provide for a consistent application of appropriate methods, consideration and use of vetted, publicly available measures, milestone workshops engaging key stakeholders, and milestone work products that are made publicly available. So about a year ago, FDA awarded 3 of these grants, and we're really excited to be working with these grantees. And we've been incredibly impressed with the strong teams that they've put together. They all have a combination of expertise in the clinical areas, clinical outcome assessment methodologies, and a strong commitment to including the patient community as they develop the core sets. We also designed into the grant multiple opportunities for stakeholder input. We hold twice yearly public meetings with an opportunity for stakeholders to ask questions and provide feedback, both as part of the meetings or by submitting feedback to the public docket. Each grantee has put together an external technical advisory committee made up of disease-specific experts, clinical outcome assessment experts, biostatisticians, patient experts, and other technical experts as appropriate who oversee and monitor the specific products. I want to touch on one part of the grant program that I think is really unusual. We realize that many trials are multi-regional or are used by multiple health authorities to make decisions. And so we've convened a scientific policy board to bring a global perspective to the standard core COA development process. This group reviews the grant milestones and provides feedback on them. They usually meet in conjunction with our public meetings, and the board is currently made up of representatives from the FDA, the National Institutes of Health, AHRQ, CMS, the VA, and regulators in Japan and the EMA in Europe. And we anticipate that this will expand and hopefully will help us to address some of the challenges that we see in the development of core outcome sets. So as you can see from this slide, we held our most recent public meeting a few weeks ago. If you weren't able to attend, a recording of the meeting is posted on the FDA website. The FDA meeting materials are also on that website, and you can also find links to other meeting materials. The public docket will be open until at least the end of this month, so please provide comment. We've had some people ask us to leave the docket open for 3 months, but our grantees are moving forward, and we really need to kind of get feedback in a timely manner as they try to meet their milestones. Also, these public meetings are held twice a year. So while we extended the timeline for comments for our December meeting, we don't really anticipate extending the comment period for this time. And as my kind of final slide, I'd like to take this opportunity to bring to your attention our newly released funding opportunity announcement. And the purpose of this funding opportunity announcement is to solicit applications to support the development of a publicly available core set of clinical outcome assessments and the related endpoints for the following 4 areas. The first would be fluid overload in nephrotic syndrome. The second would be age-appropriate domains of pediatric daily functioning. For this one, we're particularly interested in defining specific areas of daily functioning that are of highest importance to families and pediatric patients in the following age groups: birth to 3, 3 to 6, 6 to 12 years, and then 12 to 18 years. The third is a core set that will evaluate the mechanics of swallowing needed for safe eating and drinking, and the motor production of speech to assess the ability to develop or retain quality oral communication from infancy to adulthood. And finally, we're also looking for a set that will evaluate treatment effects in systemic sclerosis. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to the question and answer session. Thank you.
The final presentation of our session today is by Dr. Tom Balogh. Tom is a partner at Discern Health, which was just recently acquired by W2O. He's a thought leader on healthcare system transformation, and he helps to lead the firm's clients achieve better health and healthcare outcomes at lower cost. In his prior role, he served as a senior vice president for strategic partnerships at the National Quality Foundation. He has also served as a senior advisor and medical officer at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, where he advised senior agency leadership regarding Medicare payment and quality of care. Dr. Balogh will be presenting the perspective on core outcome sets.
Thank you, Pivy, and hello, everyone. It's my privilege to be a part of this panel today with my patient advocate and FDA regulator colleagues. As Pivy said, my perspective in this panel of stakeholder perspectives is payers. I am a partner at Discern Health, which has been recently acquired by W2O. We work with clients to improve healthcare quality through measurement and value-based payment and delivery models. Specifically for payers, we help them to position for success in the value-based environment by improving their performance and their network provider performance in quality measurement programs. So I'm going to be talking about the core measure sets for those measurement programs today. I'd like to start by thinking about the role of quality measures in payment programs broadly in this framing slide, looking at measures as an essential tool for identifying gaps and opportunities for improvement, prioritizing the conditions, processes, and settings for initiatives like these payment programs and the associated public reporting, for making decisions on therapies, vendors, and providers that support performance improvement, setting standards for providers and providing feedback, and also earning value-based incentive payments, which is really the heart of the purpose of the payment programs. So in the framework, we start with the patient at the top and how the patient is interacting with their clinician and their payment source in order to generate value. And out of the point of care delivery of services comes health data that hopefully is collected digitally and then can be used for many purposes. It can be used for real-time analytics, but it can also be used to populate quality measures. And then those measures can be used for several purposes, including for payment and public reporting incentives. And then we can measure the impact of our measurement efforts and how that informs, again, the point of care delivery at the top of the framework, with at the center all of this aimed to improve quality and lower cost. So with the role of measures in mind, where do the measures that I'm referring to for these payment programs come from? Well, I have some example sources on the left-hand column here. Example because it's not totally exhaustive, but important ones are the National Committee for Quality Assurance HEDIS measures, the Pharmacy Quality Alliance measures, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, or AHRQ, and CMS. And these measures can come from calculated from many different data sources, many different types of measures. They can be from claims or electronic systems or surveys. Surveys are often used together, patient experience data. And in fact, I want to point specifically to the AHRQ CAP surveys, Consumer Assessments of Health Plans and Systems, because those are the patient-focused surveys that both plans and their network providers are held accountable for. So there's a patient-specific aspect to quality in the measure sets that I'm going to be talking about as well. So the payers can be held accountable, and I'm going to be talking in the next slide about some of the measurement programs by which payers are specifically held accountable. And that creates an incentive to improve quality and outcomes for their members while reducing costs. But then in order to achieve their objectives in measurement, the payers must actively partner with their network providers. So you can see in the green boxes that a range of payers, Medicare, Medicaid, fee-for-service, also Medicare and Medicaid, managed care and commercial health plans, they face quality programs that hold them accountable, market-facing accountability for their performance with, for example, their employer customers, and they also are required to be accredited by regulators. And then they work with their provider networks to push the incentives down through their measurement programs, and those Providers also have publicly facing accountability through their publicly reported performance. And then they also have requirements for quality improvement activities and also accreditation in many instances. So you can see the interplay at the payer and provider level. What are some of the programs by which payers are specifically held accountable? Well, again, some examples, not necessarily an exhaustive list on the left-hand side. If you're interested in knowing more about these programs, there's a whole lot on each to be found on the internet. The Medicare Part C and D star ratings is the way Medicare Advantage plans are held accountable for their quality and costs. The Marketplace Quality Rating System, or the QRS, is the system for rating the Obamacare plans that's publicly reported so that consumers can make evidence-based decisions about where to seek care. The Federal Employees Health Benefits Plan is a number of different payers that participate in providing care to federal employees, and they use many of the same measures that the other programs on this slide use. And then the NCQA HEDIS measure sets are used in many ways, including for health plan rankings. So we just discussed how payers per se are held accountable, and that may be across the range of payers, which we see in the colored ovals here. But then, as we talked about, there are two levels. So the payers must work with their provider networks to improve quality results together. So you can see as the payers, who are subject to different types of incentives under their programs, push those down to different types of providers, that the lines of accountability start to cross. And it creates an alignment imperative because we need to somehow rationalize the system of measurement to enhance the quality signal so that we can get good comparisons from plan to plan and from provider to provider, to avoid confusion about what does it mean when Medicare Advantage reports out something different than what a commercial health plan reports out about the performance of their plan or their provider networks, and to reduce the provider reporting burden and the confusion they might have from reporting many different types of measures to many different types of plans. So we're going to talk about the role of core measure sets in achieving the alignment imperative. So lots of different folks across the measurement enterprise for payment and delivery have worked on core measure sets. The first example that I'm going to be talking about is the Core Quality Measures Collaborative, which is a partnership among the America's Health Insurance Plan Medical Directors, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and the National Quality Forum to help identify core sets. And you can see in the light green box on the right-hand side of the slide some of the core sets that have been built by the CQMC. Now, the CQMC has mainly focused on claims data that's available through payers' claim systems. So it's limited in that way by what you might think of as a least common denominator. If we aren't able to pull in robust clinical data and other data like patient-reported data, it really limits these core quality measures. So it's a starting place, but somewhat limited in the level of sophistication that can be achieved in these core measure sets that are primarily focused on claims data. There was another initiative a few years ago from the National Academy of Medicine, at that time, the Institute of Medicine, and they proposed a set of 15 cross-cutting measure topics, and you see those in the lower right-hand side of the slide. You can see these topics are very broad, things like life expectancy, well-being, patient safety generally, community engagement, very important to measure, particularly at a population level, but very broad. And even though they give guidance at the national, state, local levels about what we would want to be measuring, they didn't really identify specific measure sets for specific purposes, like a specific population or a specific disease state, specific type of provider. So they have had limited uptake and are more just sort of a menu of high-level topics that you would want to cover in a measure set. Then we have a more specific set of measure sets. These are the Medicaid core measure sets. They have been developed for the adult Medicaid population, the child population covered by Medicaid, and the Children's Health Insurance Program, and the behavioral health and maternal perinatal measure sets. I've actually found these to be some of the most useful core sets out there for the type of work we do in advising clients, because they actually get specific for a certain population. Now, you probably can't read on the right-hand side of the slide the specific line item measures, but I just present this to show you that if you go to the reference at the bottom of the slide, you can find these core sets for adult child behavioral health and maternal perinatal health. And they do take into account the needs of the vulnerable Medicaid populations. So you might find these particularly useful, but again, maybe less useful for a typical commercial population or a special age range population like the Medicare Advantage population. So again, we need specific measures and sets that are fit for purpose. And that's why sometimes these broad cores are limited in getting at those purposes. Another useful set, if you're wanting to focus on the population level, is the core set for accountable care organizations. So this core set is developed and maintained by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services for the Medicare Shared Savings Program and the Next Generation ACO program. Now, the private payers who are also contracting with these ACOs to care for a specific population have also, by and large, adopted the Medicare set in order to stay aligned, as we've been discussing. And so that's a useful set at the population level, which applies to both the payers and the providers for a specific contracted population. And then, of course, my focus has been, because of my experience on the US, but there are, of course, MIDI core sets beyond the US. I just referenced two that we often look at in our work as cross-validation, that we've looked beyond just what's happening in the US. The National Health Services in the UK uses measure sets for accountability and incentives. And the International Consortium for Health Outcomes Measures also has some standard measure sets. Now, theirs are a bit limited for the payment purpose, because although like the vital signs measures from the National Academy of Medicine, these are sort of high level and broad topics of measurement, and then you have to find the measures that might be useful for your specific purpose under the ICHOM standard set. So given those examples of core measure sets that are out there for payment and delivery, and given the purposes of measurement, just want to talk about where we are and how we might find our way forward. So if we start on the right-hand side of the slide, if everyone is just developing their own measure set for their own particular purpose and use, maybe their own particular population, their own particular conditions, sets of incentives for different purposes, we end up with a bottom-up anarchy where each program has its own measures, and they may not meet that alignment imperative. On the other hand, if we go to the left-hand extreme of the slide, this idea that there's just one measure set that can be specified by a group like the National Academy of Medicine for all purposes, then we end up with a very broad sort of dilute set at some high level common denominator. And that's not what we want either. In the middle, if we work toward a balance, we can find alignment around fit for purpose measure sets for a specific program that might be looking at a specific population like Medicaid, or might be looking at a specific condition like cardiovascular care. And we can identify priorities for that purpose. We can scan and select from the available measures. But then once we have a specific set for that specific purpose, it becomes incumbent upon the policymakers identifying the set, whether they're public or private, to align as possible across programs. So to look across other similar programs, maybe for Medicare policymakers to look across all the Medicare program measurement programs for all the different settings and all the different populations, maybe to also look across Medicaid and so on, to rationalize to the extent possible and make sure that the measures are aligning. Private sector payers should do the same thing with the public sector programs and so on. So that's how we can find that balance. And just to give you one example in my last slide here of how Medicare is attempting to do this, let's focus on the MIPS value pathways for the merit-based incentive payment system. So you may be familiar with the reform of Medicare physician payment over the last 5 years through a set of requirements under the merit-based incentive payment system that includes those categories on the left: quality measures, improvement activities, cost measures, and promoting interoperability. So there are a number of measurement requirements there. Let's just focus on the quality column there. Right now, clinicians can choose from among a menu of about 250 measures of clinical quality. And so you get a wide variation, even for physicians who are serving a similar population or who have a similar specialty. They can choose many different measures that might not even specifically apply to their population. So in order to move that toward more of a core measure set under MIPS value pathways, you can see on the right-hand side of the slide in the quality column, there will be specific value pathways, I'd labeled them A, B, and C, that are going to actually require clinicians to align their reporting for not only quality, but the other categories of performance to specifically selected measures that have been deemed to be the most pertinent to their type of patients or their specialty. So that's an example of a way that Medicare is looking to align within their payment programs and with the priorities that they have across their Medicare population. So seeking some standardization and rationalization toward core measure sets. I also mentioned the MVPs because I believe that they're going to become core for some of the other Medicare programs like hospital payment, post-acute payment. And then once Medicare is standardized, then it becomes more likely that the commercial payers and other users of measures in the private sector would standardize those. So I think this is a real movement toward that alignment balance that we're seeking between the top-down and the bottom-up options for identifying core measure sets. So thank you, and I look forward to the discussion session.